This is Bluebook Digital SAT 6, Reading and Writing Module 2. The War of 1812 has blank place in historical memory in Britain, partly because it is overshadowed by the much larger concurrent conflict against Napoleonic France, and partly because it essentially maintained the geopolitical status quo for Britain. The country neither gained nor lost significant territory or position as a result of its participation in the war. The War of 1812, of course, fighting with the United States, but they're saying it happened at the same time as battling Napoleonic France. And because the War of 1812 didn't specifically result in gaining or losing territory, I think they're going to say it has a less important or less memorable place. Let's see. Tenuous, an enduring, a contentious, a conspicuous. Well, it's definitely not enduring. That's the trick wrong answer. It's the opposite of that. They're saying it's less important or less well remembered because it's overshadowed by something else. I don't think it's contentious because that would be characterized by hostility or fighting of some kind. That doesn't quite make sense. Conspicuous would mean that it stands out. So no, it's tenuous as in shaky or hesitant or not fully realized. I would say shaky or hazy might work in that sense. In 1891, design artist William Morris co-founded the KP, which printed editions of books using pre-industrial methods. Historians argue that Morris's repudiation of industrialization is blank the K edition's use of handmade materials and intricate ornamentation reminiscent of medieval manuscripts. These meticulously handcrafted elements exemplify the artistry involved. His repudiation of industrialization, so his rejection of industrialization, is blank his use of handmade materials that are very well done. I would say the repudiation of industrialization is shown by, or is exemplified by, or is embodied by, or is taken form in, is insensible to, is manifest in, as in is takes on characteristics and is shown by, is exemplified by. Definitely not scrutinized by, as in examined by. It's not complicated by, is manifest in, as in is apparent in, is shown by example in. Blank the long-standing trend of overemphasizing teenagers and young adults in research on social media use. Scholars have recently begun to expand their focus to include the fastest-growing cohort of social media users, senior citizens. So you're doing something to the long-standing trend of overemphasizing teenagers. And the something that you're doing is by showing a different group instead. I would have said you're correcting or making up for or mitigating. Is it precluding, epitomizing, redressing, or exacerbating? Definitely not exacerbating. That would mean making worse. It's definitely making better. It's not precluding. That would be preventing somehow. Epitomizing means serving as the best example of. So it's actually the opposite of that, right? It's not serving as the best example of overemphasizing. It's correcting the problem. It's redressing. These are tough words, right? So I think, doesn't redress appear in the American Constitution where they say citizens may seek redress for their grievances, may petition the government for redress of grievances, as in fixing of problems. So fixing or mitigating, making up for, correcting. Following text is adapted from James Baldwin's 1956 novel Giovanni's Room. The narrator is riding in a taxi down a street lined with food vendors and shoppers in Paris, France. The multitude of Paris seemed to be dressed in blue every day but Sunday, when, for the most part, they put on an unbelievably festive black. Here they were now in blue, disputing every inch our passage, with their wagons, hand trucks, their bursting baskets carried at an angle steeply self-confident on the back. As used in the text, what does the word disputing most nearly mean? So it's not A, right? Arguing about is the trick wrong answer. That's what you would have said the word disputing meant without reading the passage at all. Of course, in the real world, that's what it most commonly means. But here it's used in a different way. Here they were now, and by they mean the multitude of Paris the actual people on foot, dressed, walking in the street. They were disputing our every inch and our passage. So bear in mind, this is why you always have to read the intro. They're in a taxi riding down a street lined with food vendors. So they're in a packed alleyway in France. And their progress is being disputed by people standing there physically blocking things. So disputing is physically blocking, which is, it's got to be providing resistance to, right? Not disapproving of, no, not averting possession of, yeah. It's providing physical resistance to something because the people are actually literally standing in the road blocking their way. On painter W.H.J's return to the United States in 1938 after a decade in Europe, his style underwent an abrupt transformation. Turning away from landscapes painted in an expressionist style, a style that often involves using fluid, distorted shapes and thick, textured brushstrokes to express the artist's subjective experience of reality, Johnson began painting portraits of Black Americans in a bold new way. Evocative of African sculpture and American and Scandinavian folk art, these portraits feature flat, deliberately oversimplified figures in a vibrant but limited color palette. Which choice best describes the function of the underlined sentence in the text as a whole? It elaborates on the previous sentence's statement about a transitional moment in Johnson's artistic career. Does the underlined... It actually may be that, right? Because his style underwent an abrupt transformation. I think the abrupt transformation is explained by, or this basically is, right? The blue is the abrupt transformation. He went from doing things a certain way to doing things a different way. It provides information about Johnson's travels in support of a claim. No, that's wrong in multiple ways. It recounts a moment in Johnson's personal life that enabled the success of his subsequent career, which is summarized in the following sentence. No, because the following sentence doesn't really talk about his subsequent career. It's more like what his new style looked like. That also isn't a moment in his personal life. It's a change in how he makes his art. It presents evidence that calls into question the previous sentence's characterization of Johnson's artistic development. No, I would say it explains his artistic development. It elaborates on the statement about his artistic development. Scholarly accounts of the Chicano movement, a movement that advocated for the social, political, and cultural empowerment of Mexican Americans and reached its zenith in the 1960s and 1970s, tends to focus on the most militant, outspoken figures in the movement, making it seem uniformly radical. Geographer J.H. has shown, however, that if we shift our focus toward the way the movement manifested in comparatively low-profile neighborhood institutions and projects, we see participants espousing an array of political orientations and approaches to community activism. And again, it's which best describes the function of the underlined. I'm going to try to paraphrase this. So the way that scholars look at the Chicano movement focuses on the most aggressive people, the most violent people, the people with the strongest voices, and therefore makes it seem like all Chicanos are radical. But then this person says, no, if you look at the way Chicano was used in other types of things, you see that people had different political views within it. Okay, so the underlined is what it seems like if you just look at the scholarly accounts. It presents a trend in scholarship on the Chicano movement that the text claims has been reevaluated by researchers in light of Herrera's work on the movement's participants. Maybe. That's either right or the trick wrong answer. I'm not quite sure yet. It identifies an aspect of the Chicano movement that the text implies was overemphasized by scholars due to their own political orientations. No, because it definitely does not talk about the scholars' own political orientations. It describes a common approach to studying the Chicano movement that, according to the text, obscures the ideological diversity of the movement's participants. Maybe. It summarizes the conventional method for analyzing the Chicano movement, which the text suggests creates a misleading impression of the effectiveness of neighborhood institutions and projects. Well, you had me maybe until the end part. It creates a misleading impression of the movement, but not of the effectiveness of its institutions and projects, so no. So it's either A or C. This is a tricky question, though. Is it a trend in scholarship, or is a common approach to studying the Chicano movement. Obscures the ideological diversity of the movement's participants. The second part of C sounds good to me. Has been reevaluated by researchers in light of Harari's work on the movement's participants. I think that A is the trick wrong answer, but it's only off by a little bit. A is wrong for subtle reasons. So I'm going to try to say why I think C is better. A common approach to studying Chicano movement, as in scholarly accounts as in the way people study it, tend to focus on. So that's the common approach. Then, of course, obscuring the ideological diversity matches with, it makes it seem uniformly radical. It makes it seem homogenous, but you actually, when you investigate further, see an array of political orientations, which is the definition of diversity of movement's participants. But why is it not A? A trend in scholarship, I don't think it's quite a trend would be something that they're recently doing differently or doing more. But I think they're saying they've sort of always been doing it this way, or normally they do it this way, but it's not really a trend. And then has been reevaluated. I don't think the trend itself has been reevaluated. It's the Chicano movement's underlying character has been reevaluated. So the way that people normally look at it, if you investigate further, it tends to be, is shown to be false. That's really tricky. Since its completion in 2014, BV, Vertical Forest, a pair of residential towers in Milan, Italy covered by vegetation, has become a striking symbol of environmental sustainability in architecture. SB intended his design, which features balconies that are home to hundreds of trees, to serve as a model for promoting urban biodiversity. However, the concept has faced skepticism. Critics note that although the trees used in BV were specifically cultivated for the project, it's too early to tell if they can thrive in this unusual setting. According to the text, why are some critics skeptical of the concept behind? Well, notice that the colon after the word skepticism means that it gives you an explanation. So the concept of the biodiversity faces skepticism because even though they chose the trees for the project, it's too early to tell if they can thrive in this unusual setting. So that is the reason. Now, what answer choice is that? It's that they aren't sure if the trees are going to thrive in that region. Some essential aspects of BV's design are difficult to adapt to. I thought it's unclear whether they can adapt or not, so no. The plant life of BV ended up being less varied. No. The construction of BV was no less environmentally No. It is unclear whether BV can support the plant life included in its design. Yeah, it needs to be that, right? Because it's too early to tell matches with is unclear whether it can support. Yes. EA has identified a negative correlation between the share of developing countries' economies derived from natural resource extraction and those countries' receipts of foreign investment. This may appear counterintuitive. Resource extraction requires initial investments in extractive technology, for instance, at scales best met by multinational corporations. But A notes that natural resource industry's boom-bust cycle can destabilize local currencies and increase developing countries' vulnerability to external shocks, creating levels of uncertainty to which foreign investors are typically averse. Wow, that's dense. I'm going to try to think about this in the real world. So there's a negative correlation between how much of your economy comes from natural resource extraction, like oil drilling would be the classic example, and how much foreign investment you get. So you would assume that if you're an oil-rich country, you get a lot of foreign investment. Like Venezuela would be the classic example, right? You would assume that it would get a lot of foreign investment because of its oil. But then this person says it's actually not that, and it's the other way around. And the reason it's the other way around is that there's a boom-bust cycle in the economy, by destabilizing the currency. Interesting. Okay. Which best states the main idea of the text? Although it may seem surprising that foreign investment declines in developing countries as natural resource extraction makes up a larger share of those countries' economies, that decline happens because resource extraction requires initial investments to... No, that's not the reason. No. The reason is the boom-bust cycle and the degree of uncertainty involved, therefore. So that's no. Although developing countries tend to become less dependent on foreign investment as natural resource industries make up a larger share of their economies, this change may not occur if the boom-bust cycle of those industries destabilizes local. No, it's also not about, I don't think it's about dependency, but I think that's backwards. I'm going to leave that. Although one might expect that foreign investment would increase as natural resource extraction makes up a larger share of developing countries' economies, the opposite happens because heavy reliance on natural resources can lead to unattractive conditions for investors. Yes, I think that's the answer. Although foreign investors tend to avoid initial investments in natural resource industries in developing countries, foreign investment may significantly increase as though industries stabilize. No, that's like speculation about how things would change that's beyond the scope of what it says here. Some astronomers searching for extraterrestrial life have proposed that atmospheric ammonia can serve as a biosignature gas, an indication that a planet harbors life. GHSS and colleagues evaluated this possibility, finding that on rocky planets, atmospheric ammonia likely couldn't reach detectably high levels in the absence of biological activity. But the team also found that on so-called mini-Neptunes, gas planets smaller than Neptune but with atmospheres similar to Neptune's, atmospheric pressure and temperature can be high enough to produce atmospheric ammonia. Based on the text, HS and colleagues would most likely agree with which statement about atmospheric ammonia? I'm going to try and go back and simplify this, and let me hit Control+ again. So, on rocky planets, the ammonia couldn't reach detectably high levels in the absence of biological activity. So on rocky planets, if you have ammonia, that means you have life. On rocky planets, ammonia in the atmosphere means you must have life. But on the mini-Neptunes, you can have ammonia even without life. Okay. Its presence is more likely to indicate that a planet is a mini-Neptune No, it's more like its presence is more likely to indicate life on a rocky planet than on a mini-Neptune. Its absence from a planet that's not a mini-Neptune indicates that the planet probably... That seems like you're speculating beyond what you could know based on what's stated, so I don't think it's that. It should be treated as a biosignature gas if detected in the atmosphere of a rocky planet, but not if... Yeah, that's the answer, right? As in, you could only reach detectably high levels... you couldn't reach detectably high levels in the absence of biological activity on a rocky planet. So if you have significant ammonia on a rocky planet, it must have been because of life. But that's not the case on the mini-Neptune. Let me just be thorough and read the last one. It doesn't reliably reach high enough concentrations in the atmospheres of rocky planets and mini-Neptunes to be true. No. Lines Written in Early Spring is a 1798 poem by William Wordsworth. In the poem, the speaker describes having contradictory feelings while experiencing the sights and sounds of a spring day. Contradictory feelings while experiencing the sights and sounds of a spring day, so it's going to give you an example of that, right? So has to be some good and some bad feelings while you're looking at sights and sounds of a spring day. Through primrose tufts in that sweet bower, the periwinkle trailed its wreaths, and 'tis my faith that every flower enjoys the air it breathes. That doesn't seem contradictory. That seems only positive. So I don't think so. The budding twigs spread out their fan to catch the breezy air, and I must do all I can, that there was pleasure there. That doesn't seem contradictory to me, but... The birds around me hopped and played, their thoughts I cannot measure, but the least motion which they made, it seemed a thrill of pleasure. Again, that seems only positive to me. I'm hoping it's the last one. I heard 1,000 blended notes, while in a grove I sat reclined, in that sweet mood when pleasant thoughts bring sad thoughts to the mind. It has to be that one, right? Because that's the only one that mentions a negative. So that's the only one that can be contradictory because it has positives and negatives. Mottled radial growth of sugar maple trees, with and without nitrogen, in current, moderate change and extreme change. These to me are about as tough as it gets on the new digital SAT. So we're in the middle of section 2, the really tricky graph reading questions that are very dense, having gotten all of the questions right on section 1. I'm just going to guess without even getting into it that this is about as hard as it's going to get on this entire test. But here we go. I and colleagues studied a forest site in which some sugar maple trees receive periodic fertilization with nitrogen to mimic the broader trend of increasing anthropogenic nitrogen deposition in soil. So you give them periodic fertilization with nitrogen to mimic man-made nitrogen deposition in soil, right? So anthropogenic is in made by human beings, okay? I and colleagues modeled the radial growth of the trees with and without nitrogen fertilization under 3 different climate scenarios: the current climate, moderate change, and extreme change, okay? Although they found that climate change would negatively affect growth, they concluded that anthropogenic nitrogen deposition could more than offset that effect, provided that change is moderate rather than extreme. So the whole point of all of this is what's down here. Anthropogenic nitrogen deposition could more than offset that effect, as in more than offset the negative effect, provided that change is moderate rather than extreme. So I think what they're saying is when you go from current to moderate, the bars both go down, but the with nitrogen, right, the one where you mimic the anthropogenic nitrogen deposition, you can still get this to go up. So I think what they're saying is when you go from this black to this gray, when you go from the left black to the middle gray, even though it's theoretically worse overall, you can overcome the fact that it's worse by using the nitrogen. But then when you go from the moderate to the extreme, even with the nitrogen, it drops way off. Okay, which choice best describes data from the graph that support I and colleagues' conclusion? Growth with nitrogen under the current climate exceeded growth with nitrogen under moderate change. That's true. But the latter exceeded growth without nitrogen under extreme change. That's true, but not the answer. So that's those facts are true, but they don't prove the point that it's trying to make here. I think what they're saying is from the left black to the middle gray actually goes up. I'm going to keep that in my mind as what I think the correct answer should be. Growth without nitrogen under the current climate exceeded growth without nitrogen under moderate change, but the latter exceeded growth with nitrogen under extreme change. I think that's true, but not the answer. Growth with nitrogen under moderate change exceeded growth without nitrogen under moderate change, but the latter exceeded growth without nitrogen under extreme change. I'm hoping it's the last one, but this is a really tough question. Growth with nitrogen under moderate change exceeded growth without nitrogen under the current climate. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, as in the middle gray is higher than the left black, but the latter, as in without nitrogen under the current climate. So the left black exceeded growth with nitrogen under, yes, it's D. So let me try to explain that one more time. I'm going to say the last sentence one more time. Although they found that climate change would negatively affect growth, they concluded that anthropogenic nitrogen deposition could more than offset that effect, provided that change is moderate rather than extreme. So if you only have moderate climate change, then artificially using nitrogen can fix the problem of the climate change. But if you have extreme climate change, then artificially using nitrogen cannot help, which is D as in dog. That's really tricky. Under normal atmospheric pressure at Earth's surface, water molecules form a tetrahedral network stabilized by hydrogen bonds between adjacent molecules. Extreme high pressure, such as can be found in deep ocean waters, destabilizes these bonds and compresses water structure, allowing water molecules within organisms to permeate proteins and impede crucial biological functions. Yet deep-sea organisms known as piezophiles have adapted to extreme pressures. Studies have found a positive correlation between the depths that various piezophiles inhabit and concentrations of a compound called trimethylamine N oxide, TMAO, in their muscle tissues, which has led a team of researchers to hypothesize that TMAO reduces water's compressibility. Which finding, if true, would most directly support the researchers' hypothesis? So for ones like this, I always try to paraphrase to myself in simpler terms. Just go back and summarize. So extreme high pressure destabilizes water, which can so under extreme high pressure, the water can get into the flesh of an animal and impede its biological functions. Yet, so somehow piezophiles have adapted, okay? And then there's a correlation between how deep they are and how much of this TMAO stuff they have, which has led researchers to conclude that TMAO solves the problem, right? TMAO reduces the water's compressibility, okay? Water molecules are found to be impervious to TMAO even when the water molecule's tetrahedral configuration has been distorted by high pressure. Well, no, impervious to as in can't be affected by. So it's definitely not that, right? The water molecules definitely have to be able to be affected by the TMAO. Examination of TMAO's molecular structure shows that TMAO molecules retain their shape even as pressure increases. I think that's a confusing misreading of it. It has to be somehow that actually, I'm going to leave that one. A positive correlation is found between concentrations of TMAO and the rate at which water's molecular structure compresses as pressure increases. What a confusing. Correlation is found between concentration of TMAO and the rate at which water's molecular structure compresses as pressure increases. I'm not sure. Analysis of water's molecular structure under high pressure reveals that hydrogen bonds are more stable when TMAO is present than when it is not. That seems to make sense to me. So it seems like D as in dog is basically saying the TMAO stops water from compressing. Now let's try and go back and match what it says here. The water molecules form a tetrahedral network stabilized by hydrogen bonds between adjacent molecules. Okay, but then, so under normal conditions, you have it's stabilized by hydrogen bonds, but then it gets super compressed and causes problems. The piezophiles use the compound to, make those hydrogen bonds more stable. Yeah, that makes sense as the correct answer to 12. Okay. Simulated change in annual aquifer input and irrigation output if precipitation concentration increases as climate models predict. Baseline concentration, okay. Percent change in watering enter aquifers, percent change in surface water used for irrigation, percent change in groundwater used for irrigation. Under the scenarios of precipitation is currently somewhat concentrated, precipitation is currently evenly distributed. Again, we're in the most dense zone of tough chart reading in the middle of section 2 when you've got them all right on section 1. So this is about as hard as it gets. Some climate models for the western U.S. predict that while total annual precipitation may remain unchanged from the present level, precipitation will become concentrated into fewer but more intense rain and snow events. University of Texas Climate Sciences GP and her colleagues simulated how the amount of water entering aquifers and the amount being used for irrigation purposes would change if this were to occur. P and her colleagues concluded that concentrations of precipitation into fewer events would result in a higher number of dry days, triggering more irrigation, but that this change in irrigation output is highly sensitive to the baseline concentration of precipitation that currently exists in an area. So dense, right? Which choice best describes data from the table that support P and her colleagues' conclusion? They concluded that, I'm going to say this one more time because this is a really tough question. They concluded that concentration of precipitation into fewer events would result in a higher number of dry days, triggering more irrigation, but that this change in irrigation output is highly sensitive to the baseline concentration of precipitation. I think I understand what they're saying now. So the baseline concentration is whether you're in this row or this row. It's whether you're in the difference between the middle and the bottom row, right? So that's the baseline concentration. So the middle row, the yellow row, is the baseline concentration of precipitation being currently somewhat concentrated. Then the bottom row is precipitation is evenly distributed. So they're saying it would result in a higher number of dry days, triggering more irrigation. So I think what they're saying is the 0.9 and the 7.9 are both increases, but the 7.9 is a much, much larger increase because of the starting baseline concentration being more evenly distributed. I believe that's what they're saying. So if baseline concentration is somewhat concentrated, the amount of water being used for irrigation will increase 0.4% for surface water and 0.9% for groundwater, whereas the amount of water entering aquifers will increase. Yeah, but it can't be that, because that doesn't draw a distinction between the yellow row and the blue row. So that might be true, but that's not the answer. If baseline precipitation is somewhat concentrated, water used for irrigation will increase only slightly, whereas it will increase 9% for surface water and 7.9% for groundwater if baseline precipitation is evenly distributed. Yes. Yeah. Now I understand. So both of these numbers only go up a little bit if it's currently somewhat concentrated, whereas both of these numbers go up much more if it's currently evenly distributed. I think it's that. If baseline precipitation is somewhat concentrated, the amount of water entering aquifers will increase. Well, no, that doesn't apply, right? Because that is not the, well, actually, maybe it is. Hold on. Will increase 4.9%, while the amount being used for irrigation. Well, no, because that's true, but that doesn't draw a distinction between the yellow row and the blue row. So no. If baseline precipitation is somewhat concentrated, water used for irrigation will decline by a small amount. Definitely not decline, right? So no, it's B as in boy. That question took a long time, and it was also really tough to explain, but I eventually did figure it out. It's just a very, very dense question, and we're at the hardest part of the verbal right here. In a 2013 study, AG, JY, and MD compared the feeding behaviors of wild lions in Tanzania's T National Park with those of captive lions in Spain's Sea Reserve. The researchers noted that previous studies focused on other carnivores have shown that providing animals with food at regular intervals, as is common in captive settings, may inadvertently facilitate the development of novel stereotypic, i.e. purposely repetitive behaviors, by reducing the need for a high degree of cognitive engagement with the environment. The researchers were therefore not altogether surprised to find that. Let me try to paraphrase this into the real world. So you're looking at lions in captive settings, okay, versus lions in a wild setting. Providing animals with food at regular intervals, as is common in captive settings. So if a lion is in a zoo and every hour you just give it a steak, right? You give it all the food that it wants every hour and it never gets hungry. It inadvertently facilitates development of novel stereotypic, i.e. purposely repetitive behaviors. So the lions start doing something repetitive by reducing the need for a high degree of cognitive engagement with the environment. So because the lion no longer has to think and hunt in order to find food, it just starts doing some dumb other thing as a distraction. So they weren't surprised to find that. So I'm just guessing the answer is an example of a lion doing some dumb repetitive task because it doesn't have to think to find food. Bones from carcasses provided to captive lions showed signs of extensive gnawing beyond the point of nutrient extraction, whereas bones from prey hunted by wild lions did not. Maybe it actually is that one, because that seems like a novel stereotypic, as in purposely repetitive, right? They're gnawing on the bone. They chew the bone even after they've gotten the food out of it. Let's leave that one. During feeding episodes, captive male lions showed much more aggression than in wild male lions, whereas has nothing to do with male and female. When caretakers placed food in boxes that were cognitively demanding to open, captive lions showed repeated behaviors similar to those that wild lions showed. No, that's like some alternate scenario that's beyond what you could speculate on based on what it says here. Captive lions showed a stereotypic behavior of pacing in their enclosures as feeding times approached, whereas wild lions showed a stereotypic No, it has to be that only the captive ones showed the novel stereotypic behavior, right? Because only the ones with given food at regular intervals. So it's a really tough question, but A gives you an example of a novel stereotypic, as in purposely repetitive activity. When you first look at A, you're like, what? What does that have to do with anything? But then if you look at exactly what it says, that actually is the specifics of what it's pointing out. In AE's 1903 cookbook titled Le Guide Culinaire, the chef included over 5,000 dishes, including œuf au roer, baked eggs, gambas, jumbo shrimp, and garlic sauce, and tarte au pignon, pain à tarte. Such iconic French recipes described in surprisingly brief detail in Le Guide Culinaire. Blank the Victorian French cuisine Escoffier sought to preserve in his encyclopedic book. So in the last sentence, if you pick just one word, the subject is recipes, right? The iconic French recipes, then you could almost cross out what's between the commas as just extra, right? Described in whatever. The iconic French recipes blank. The recipes epitomize. That's the only one that matches in number. Consider the mechanics of the pinhole camera. Light passes through a small hole, resulting in a focused projected image. A ray diagram reveals how this blank. The hole's small size restricts light to a single ray. All light passing through the hole can only arrive at a single destination, eliminating diffraction and ensuring a clear image. Okay, well, it's definitely not B as in boy, because that would be a comma splice mistake, right? Or I'm sorry, C as in cat would be a comma splice mistake. Array diagram reveals how this works. It's because actually, C as in cat is wrong for multiple reasons, but it's not that. D as in dog, well, now that I think about it, C and D are both wrong because the its is actually wrong. The correct answer is B as in boy. I'm going to read it with B as in boy. Array diagram reveals how this works. Because the hole's small size restricts light to a single ray, all light passing through the hole can only arrive at a single destination, eliminating diffraction and ensuring a clear image. Yeah. Let me try and say a different example, right? So a sketch of the solar system reveals how things work, period. Because the outer planets orbit farther apart, comma, their orbits take longer. So I know that in grade school, they tell people not to start a sentence with because, although in this case, it's actually correct. So you can't just say, because you're my friend. Obviously, that's not a sentence by itself. But you can say, because you're my friend, I treat you nicely. So you can start with because, as long as you follow through with the full statement. Long attributed to Jacques-Louis David, the preeminent neoclassical painter of his day, the 1801 painting M.J.C. de Vallon gained fresh attention in the 1990s when art historians discovered that the painting, which depicts a solitary young woman sketching, was actually the work of little-known French portrait blank Marie-Denise Villers. Well, it can't be C as in cat because you can't have a full statement ending right there. You can't say, it was actually the work of little-known French portrait artist, because you wouldn't know who the French portrait artist is. Then it's not another dash because you've already used the 2 dashes here to offset extra information, and you would not put another long pause right here. So it's either a pause or nothing. Let me say it with a pause. It was actually the work of little-known French portrait artist Marie Denise Villers. Or, it was actually the work of little-known French portrait artist Marie Denise Villers. Yeah, the correct answer is that you would not pause at all right here. So I think most or all of the questions of this type have ended up being that you do not pause or that there's no punctuation in the correct answer, I believe, for most of the ones from this Bluebook test number 6. In 1986, conceptual artist Sophie Calle asked 23 people, all of whom had been born without sight, to describe, quote, their image of beauty in rich detail. Calle paired excerpts of these conversations with photographs, both of interviewees and the items they blank, to powerful effect in her exhibition The Blind. Oh, I see. So you have to escape from the dash unit, right? So it's dash both of X and Y to powerful effect. She paired these conversations with photographs to powerful effect, which seems like it has to be B as in boy. Yeah. She paired excerpts of these conversations with photographs, both of interviewees and the items they described, from hair to grass to sculptures, to powerful effect in her exhibition The Blind, because you could skip over what's between the dashes. Calle paired excerpts of these conversations with photographs to powerful effect in her exhibition The Blind. American abstract artist Richard Blank, his installations to make passers-by keenly aware of how one's movements are affected by the physical features of one's environment, assembles large-scale steel plates into sculptures that dominate the outdoor spaces they occupy. This is hard because everyone makes the same mistake on this. Everyone only looks at what it is in order instead of reading the entire sentence. You have to read the entire sentence to understand why the answer is the right answer. You at least have to read it down to assembles. So, American artist Richard Serra blank assembles large-scale steel plates. This is the actual main verb of the sentence. The answer is actually C as in cat. American artist Richard Serra intending to whatever, or intending his installations to whatever, comma, it turns everything between the commas basically into a big adjective. American artist Richard Serra American abstract artist Richard Serra, intending his installations to make passers-by keenly aware of how one's movements are affected by the physical features of one's environment, assembles large-scale steel plates into sculptures that dominate the outdoor spaces they occupy. That's hard. A species of bee algae produces toxins to avoid being eaten by predators. However, in some cases, the toxins the organism uses to protect itself from predation actually blank its attractiveness to predators. The Hawaiian sea slug, for example, not only tolerates bee toxins, but actually uses them for protection in the same way the algae does. Okay, so the species produces toxins to avoid being eaten by predators. However, in some cases, the toxins the organism uses to protect itself from predation actually... So it's the toxins that are doing whatever goes right here. The toxins increase its attractiveness to predators. Yeah. Historians agree that the jazz pianist J.R.M. was exaggerating when he claimed to have invented jazz music. No one can deny blank that Morton's innovative compositions and remarkable improvisational skills helped shape jazz as a genre during its early years. Yeah, so instinctively I was going to put however. No one can deny, however. So they know he was exaggerating when he said that he invented it, but no one can deny that he had a big influence on it. So they know he was exaggerating. No one can deny, however, as in no one can deny though. Yeah. Not therefore the second place, in other words. Biographer M.G. notes that the novelist Henry James, quote, lived in a world of second thoughts, frequently tinkering with his novels and stories after their initial publication. However, the differences between the 1881 first edition and the 1908 edition of his novel A Portrait of a Lady are extreme, even by James's standards. Blank, some critics regard the two editions as two different novels altogether. So it's more like, so everybody knew that he played around with his novels after they first came out and made small adjustments. But the adjustments between these two are extreme even by his standards. Blank, some critics regard the two editions as different novels altogether. It's not by contrast or nevertheless, because that doesn't go against it. The fact that some critics regard the two editions as two different novels altogether actually confirms that the differences between the two editions are extreme. I would have said indeed or and as a matter of fact. So it's got to be in fact. It's not in other words because it's not a paraphrasing of the same point. In hindsight, given the ideas about the natural world circulating among British scientists in the 1800s, the theory of natural selection was an obvious next step. It may not have been a coincidence, blank, that Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace arrived at the concept independently. Indeed, contrary to the popular myth of the lone genius, theirs is not the first paradigm-shifting theory to have emerged from multiple scholars working in parallel. It was an obvious next step. It may not have been a coincidence. Well, just instinctively, I was going to put the word then. It may not have been a coincidence then that they arrived at the concept independently, as shown by that wouldn't be the first time that multiple people figured it out together. I think it's then, but it may not have been a coincidence. Definitely not, however. Definitely not, for example. Yeah, it's not furthermore or moreover. Yeah, it may not have been a coincidence then, or it may not have been a coincidence therefore. Yeah. In a recent study, researchers examined the sleeping and waking habits of a group of dairy cows to determine if the cow's pattern of activity suggested that the animals were diurnal, nocturnal, or crepuscular. Blank, the researchers studied whether the cows were most active in the daytime, diurnal, nighttime, nocturnal, or at dawn and dusk, crepuscular. Well, it's not afterward, because it literally just is that. They studied to determine if it was whether they were those three things, and it just is those three things. Yeah, it's just in other words, right? Not afterwards. Not additionally. Definitely not however, but it's not additionally because it's not another thing. That just literally is studying whether they wore one of those three types of sleeping and waking pattern. Wants to emphasize a similarity between P waves and S waves. Emphasize a similarity. P waves and S waves both travel beneath Earth's surface, causing the ground to move. That sounds good. P waves travel away from an Earth starting point at a higher rate of... No. Well, I don't think so. That's sort of a similarity, but it's not really emphasizing the similarity. It's saying that there's a slight difference between them. Spreading out from the focus of an earthquake, P waves move the... Well, no. Although P waves and S waves start at the same point, they behave very differently. No. Just got to be the first one, right? That's emphasizing the similarity. Wants to indicate the California red-legged frog's FWS classification category. Indicate the California red-legged frog's FWS classification category. So whatever the answer is, it's the California red-legged frog has this FWS classification category. Species on the FWS list, which include the California red-legged frog, are classified as either endangered or threatened. The California red-legged frog appears on the FW list of at-risk species. Maybe. According to the FWS, the California red-legged frog is in the endangered category, in danger of extinction throughout most or all of its range. That sounds the best to me so far, but I'm going to have to cross-reference back here. Likely to soon become endangered, the California red-legged frog is classified as threatened by the FWS. So this might be one of those where it actually misquotes the facts in the answer choices, so you do have to look back. Well, it looks like it's the last fact that matters here. The California red-legged frog is likely to soon become endangered, according to the FWS. Oh, I see. Okay. Species on the list are classified as either endangered or threatened. So if it's soon to become endangered, that must mean that it's threatened right now. Yeah, which is what it says here. Yeah, soon to become endangered is classified as threatened. Okay. So its current classification category is threatened. Man, that's tough. So it actually is D as in dog, right? The California red-legged frog is classified as threatened. And then, yeah, it's not C as in cat. C as in cat, reading it would have been okay, but it doesn't match the fact back here because it says it's likely to soon become endangered, which means it's classified as threatened. Man, that's tricky. Okay. Student wants to make a generalization about the materials used in dough replicas. Make a generalization about the materials used in dough replicas. A traditional material that was used to stitch together the hulls of ancient doughs, coconut palm fiber rope, is still used by shipbuilders. I don't think it's that because that's not materials plural. That's one material, but I'm going to leave that. The ancient Arab dough was a sailing vessel used primarily for trade and distinguishable by, well, no, because that doesn't mention materials. Although most materials used in dough replicas are traditional, some modern materials are used. Maybe. Contemporary shipbuilders in Oman build replicas of the dough, which was an ancient sailing vessel with a stitched hull construction. That doesn't say the materials, so no. Now, yeah, C is a generalization. It's also multiple materials.